and the US campaign for End the Israeli Occupation. Phyllis.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for your work. Thank you all for inspiring those of us who have come in from other parts of the world to see that, yes, the movement that was born in opposition to one war remains powerful as we challenge the new wars. You know, we have a lot of anniversaries. The anniversary of February 15th, for me, is far more important than the anniversary of March 19th, the anniversary of the day the war began, the day the British and US troops invaded and planes bombed Iraq. And I think that as we think back on February 15th, there are many aspects of it that become very important for our current work, as well as how we remember and our history, and how it inspired all of us. It was the first truly global protest. It was at that time the largest gathering, the largest not only protest, but the largest one-day rising of humanity in the history of the world, bar none. That's enormous. What an achievement. What an achievement. In 6 weeks after somebody got up at a meeting in Florence and said, we need to do this on February 15th. And that model that brought social movements and people across the country, around the world, into the streets on the same day with one slogan, the world says no to war, called and chanted and sang in 150 different languages. This was an extraordinary moment. And it provides a model, not only for what we need to do to reach out to those social movements that continue fighting all around the world, but it was a model that was so powerful that it forced governments around the world to do something they didn't want to do, which was to say no to the United States. You remember in the Security Council, which was fighting, the US and the Brits were in there fighting desperately to get a second resolution that would make their war legal. It would never have made it legitimate. Nothing could make that war legitimate. But if they had managed to bribe and punish and threaten enough governments, they would have gotten a certain narrowly defined kind of legality, and they desperately wanted to do that. But because people were filling the streets of capitals around the world, you had this phenomenon known as the uncommitted six. 6 small, dependent countries who on their own would never have had the ability to stand up to the United States. Chile, Mexico, Yemen, no. Chile, Mexico, Cameroon, Guinea, Angola. Somebody help me here. I'm missing one. Mexico, Chile, Cameroon, Guinea, Angola, Pakistan, 6. Not one of them would have gone head-to-head with the US, but they all did. They all refused the pressure because people like us, our sisters and brothers around the world, were filling their capitals as well as our own, making it impossible for them to give in to US pressure. And then when enough countries had that kind of pressure, for their own reason, we can't have any illusion that these governments were on our side. They had their own narrowly defined reasons for opposing that particular imperialist war. But that tactical alliance became very important, because then it meant that the United Nations itself was able to do what its charter says it must, but what it almost never does, stand against the scourge of war. That morning of February 15th, when after following the sun, the demonstrations had moved from the South Pacific and through Australia and New Zealand and across Asia and down across Europe and down throughout Africa and jumped across the pond to Latin America and finally, last of all, came to the United States. And that morning, as we were hearing the news of what was happening all around the world, a small group of us went to a meeting across what was called the frozen zone, and it was really, really freezing. But this was the term used by the New York Police Department that had declared a frozen zone in front of the United Nations that no one could enter, except we had permission for this small group, because we were led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to meet with Kofi Annan. And these 2 great African statesmen looked at each other across the table. And Bishop Tutu began, and he said, "We are here on behalf of the people who are marching in 665 cities today. And we're here to tell you that those people marching in all those cities, we claim the United Nations as our own. We claim it in the name of the global mobilization for peace. It was an amazing moment. It was an amazing moment because the people's movements were at the core of what became an unstoppable global movement that brought in governments and brought in the UN against all of their instincts because we forced them to do it. And during that rally that went on for hours and hours, despite the cold, everybody was speaking. Midway through it, we got word backstage that the Associated Press had just issued a 2-line statement that was published around the world that said, stung by the outpouring of global criticism, Britain and the US have just announced that they are giving up the effort to get a second resolution. That was huge. Now, we know it did not stop the war. It did not stop the war. But it showed the world that this war was illegal for those who had doubted. It stopped the UN from endorsing a war and destroying its own legitimacy, whatever legitimacy it had left. It went a far way in preventing war in Iran. That mobilization and what came after it are a big reason why we are not at war with Iran today. In the United States, interestingly, it was that mobilization and the movement that it gave rise to that was a major part in electing Barack Obama. And while that has been a mixed bag at best, the achievement of electing an African-American president in my country, a country grounded in genocide and slavery, was an unbelievable achievement, despite all of what came later. Despite all of the failures, despite all of the warmongering, that achievement remains, and it was the peace movement that was one of the fundamental components that made it possible. And one of the other things that was so important was that February 15th has given rise to new movements around the world. The Arab Spring takes hope from the events of February 15th. Activists in Cairo speak today of their memories of February 15th and how they were embarrassed that the protest in Cairo was so small relative to the millions marching in the West. And then they made good on that promise 10 years later, when they went back to Tahrir Square and said, not only we're going to have another Hyde Park, but we're going to throw out a dictator. And they did. And it was February 15th that was part of what inspired them to believe that they could do it. So we have many anniversaries. We have anniversaries still to come, certainly the anniversary of the war itself, the anniversary on March 16th of the killing of Rachel Corrie, the anniversary in May of George Bush's incredible remark about mission accomplished. We have many anniversaries. We have many anniversaries. And as Kate said, we will have more of these, their anniversaries and ours, their memories and ours. Things that we will claim, movements that will join so that we join the movement to close Guantanamo Bay. We join the movements to make sure that the driving down of the number of troops, the reduction in the number of troops in Afghanistan, they won't say they're going to end the war because they're not until we make them, but they will reduce the number of troops there, and we have to make sure that that is not transformed into a drone war all around the world. We have a lot of work ahead. But we have, in these new challenges, some extraordinary new possibilities to finally have some level of accountability for Tony Blair and George Bush. The war criminals of one war should not be allowed to walk free as their heirs carry out wars somewhere else. But more important, as we work to prevent the transformation of these wars into drone wars, as we work for accountability, as we work to shut down Guantanamo Bay once and for all, we also have to change how we see our own movement. We've been hearing extraordinary analysis just now of how our movement, the peace movement, gave shape in this moment from the global justice movement, from the movement that said another world is possible. February 15th was part of what that other world will look like. And as we saw the rise of the indignados in Spain, the rise of the Occupy movement in the United States and then further around the world, it comes back to the models of how our movements work together. And at this moment, when the world's economic crisis is strangling people's lives, destroying families, leading to suicides of people who can't support their families, we can look to our obligation, our peace movement's obligation, to link with these other movements, the movements that are rising in response to the economic crisis, to say that it is the cost of war, the cost of bombs, the cost of planes and bullets and guns. That's why we don't have money for jobs. And we need to stop spending money on the military and bring that money home to provide jobs and school and health care for everyone. The fact that in my country they find the money for jobs never, but they find the money for war always. There are 40 million people in the United States who have no access to health care because they have no insurance. 20% of the children in my country go to bed hungry while they find money for every war on the books. We need a Robin Hood tax. We need a financial transaction tax and use that money from the rich to begin to pay for these projects. But we also need a new tax on the war profiteers to make sure that they don't profit from these wars. And as we look at what we have accomplished in the years since February 15th, we have changed public opinion. We have transformed in the United States support for wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to massive, huge majorities of opposition to those wars. Support and cheerleading for the wars has turned into abandonment of the war projects. And yet, the policies have not changed. The policies remain, the wars remain. And what we need to do now, and this challenge is even greater than the challenge of changing public opinion, what we need to do now is change the policies. That means we have to reclaim our democracies. On February 15th, standing in front of the United Nations on that extraordinary day, on that incredibly cold morning, the great activist Danny Glover looked out at the crowd and he said, "We stand here on this threshold of history because our right to dissent has been hijacked, and we say to the world, not in our name." And it was at that moment that the crowd picked up that call and said, "Not in our name," as the claim of what February 15th would mean. We had become the second superpower. Now we have to take on the first superpower, engage with power, and win that struggle. Thank you.